Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof, a concrete fortress surrounded by icy waters and impossible odds. For decades, the government insisted no one ever escaped the rock. But in 1962, 3 men vanished into the darkness and were never seen again. Did they drown? Or did they pull off the greatest prison escape in American history? Tonight, we uncover the truth behind Alcatraz, and the escape that still haunts the FBI. The Rock Rises. Why Alcatraz had to become escape-proof? 500-plus characters. Long before it became the most infamous prison in the United States, Alcatraz was nothing more than an isolated, wind-beaten island jutting out of the violent waters of San Francisco Bay. Covered in bird droppings, sharp rock, and swirling fog, the island didn't seem destined for greatness or terror. But geography has a strange way of deciding fate. The currents surrounding the island were brutally unforgiving. Even strong swimmers struggled for minutes before their muscles seized. Temperatures rarely climbed above the low 50s. Fog could swallow entire ships. Waves slammed against the cliffs without mercy. To the U.S. government, this wasn't a hazard. It was an opportunity. And so, in the mid-19th century, the island was transformed into a defensive military outpost, a fortress armed with cannons and soldiers ready to protect the west coast. But as time passed, the fort's role evolved. It shifted from fortress to prison. By 1859, Alcatraz held military convicts, Civil War deserters, traitors, men who challenged military authority. And during the 1890s, Native American leaders resisting U.S. expansion were imprisoned there, including Hopi men who opposed the forced removal of their children to boarding schools. Alcatraz was already feared, but the worst was yet to come. The government's problem: too many escapes, too much violence. By the early 1930s, the U.S. federal prison system was collapsing under a wave of criminals unlike anything America had seen before. Prohibition mobsters, machine gun-wielding gangsters, bank-robbing syndicates, prison escape artists, men who could bribe guards or break out of anything. The country was in chaos. John Dillinger broke out of jail with a fake wooden gun. Gangsters tore through cities with Tommy guns. Federal prisons were overcrowded, corrupt, and embarrassingly vulnerable. The Department of Justice was desperate. They needed a prison so secure, so psychologically crushing, so isolated, that not even the most dangerous criminals could organize, rebel, or escape. A place where violence would be neutralized, escape would be impossible, communication would be severed, power structures would collapse. A prison meant not to punish the body, but to break the spirit. They needed a new kind of maximum security. They needed a place that criminals themselves feared. They needed Alcatraz, the transformation of the Rock. In 1934, the island was officially handed over from the U.S. Army to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Overnight, Alcatraz began a staggering transformation into the federal government's most terrifying penitentiary. Architects reinforced the walls with steel. Windows were fortified. Cell doors were redesigned to be nearly noise-free, preventing communication. Gun galleries were installed so guards could monitor prisoners from elevated, protected walkways. Every escape route, even theoretical ones, was analyzed and sealed. The prison's design reflected a single philosophy: no one escapes the Rock. Everything was built around that mission. The isolated location, the freezing water, the bone-chilling wind, the concrete walls thick enough to muffle screams. The guards trained to shoot to kill. Even the rules were structured to break prisoners mentally. Silence for most of the day. No group contact. No personal belongings. No talking during meals. No privacy. Constant head counts. A rigid daily schedule with zero variation. Alcatraz wasn't aiming to rehabilitate. It aimed to control. The world's most feared men arrive. By late 1934, Alcatraz's first transport of inmates arrived, and the world watched in morbid fascination. These were no ordinary prisoners. These were the worst of the worst as defined by the FBI. Escape artists, crime bosses, killers, armed robbers, men who had corrupted guards in other prisons, men who orchestrated kidnappings and murders from behind bars. Among them, Al Capone, king of Chicago's criminal empire, George Machine Gun Kelly, Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's legendary kingpin, Arthur Doc Barker of the Barker Carpus Gang, Robert Stroud, the Birdman, but not as Hollywood portrayed him. They arrived shackled, silent, and stripped of dignity. The moment the ferry doors opened, a new reality hit them. On the Rock, your name doesn't matter. Your legend doesn't matter. Your past power means nothing. You were not a gangster here. You were a number. And the Rock was undefeated. The myth begins, nobody escapes Alcatraz. From the beginning, the prison used its environment as propaganda. The government publicly declared, no inmate will ever escape Alcatraz alive. They believed the ice-cold waters, violent tides, and relentless currents would drown anyone desperate or foolish enough to try. For the first time in U.S. history, law enforcement had a prison that looked, and felt, unbreakable. Criminals feared it. Politicians praised it. And newspapers turned it into legend. But legends have a weakness. Someone always tries to break them. And on a foggy night in 1962, 3 prisoners did the unthinkable. They didn't just challenge the system. They may have beaten it. Life on the Rock. A routine built to break the human mind for 500-plus characters. What made Alcatraz so feared wasn't just the location. It wasn't the icy waters, the gun towers, or even the barbed wire. It was the routine. A mechanical, soul-stripping system engineered to break even the toughest, most hardened criminals America had ever produced. Alcatraz wasn't merely a prison. It was a perfectly calibrated psychological weapon. The first realization, you own nothing, not even your name. The moment a prisoner entered Alcatraz, he was stripped, searched, shaved, photographed, and assigned a number. That number, not his name, became his identity. Al Capone was no longer Scarface, the mob king of Chicago. He became prisoner number 85. Machine Gun Kelly was reduced to number 117. The Birdman became number 594. Inside the Rock, everyone became a number. Prisoners weren't allowed personal belongings. No photos of family. No letters unless approved. No talking without permission. Even their thoughts didn't feel private. Guards walked the tiers every few minutes, listening, watching, recording. This wasn't rehabilitation. It was control. The day begins before the sunrise. Alcatraz inmates woke up to the clanging sound of cell doors and the icy air rolling in through cracks in the ancient structure. Fog often seeped under the door frames, making the early hours feel freezing even in summer. At 6:30 a.m., the lights blasted on. Prisoners had seconds to stand at attention. Guards walked the tier, checking faces, posture, and compliance. One wrong move? Punishment. Inmates ate breakfast in complete silence. The mess hall was considered the most dangerous room in the prison, because it contained forks and knives. To mitigate the risk, the prison positioned armed guards on catwalks above, rifles pointed at inmates below. Even today, a sign still hangs in the old dining hall. Do not talk. Do not move without permission. Meals were basic. Oatmeal or cold cereal. Black coffee. Toast. Sometimes eggs on weekends. The food wasn't meant to nourish, it was meant to remind. The code of silence, the most brutal rule of all. Imagine living with 200 men, but never being allowed to speak to them. Alcatraz enforced a strict no-talking rule for decades. Prisoners caught whispering were punished. Repeat offenders were sent to D-block, solitary confinement. The silence served a purpose. No communication meant no escape planning. No alliances meant no gangs. No gossip meant no rebellions. But the unintended consequence? Silence slowly crushed the human spirit. Former inmate Jim Quillen wrote, "I'd forgotten the sound of my own voice." Men began talking to themselves. Some hummed songs quietly to feel human. Others simply stared at the wall hour after hour, locked inside their minds. The cells, smaller than a parking space. Alcatraz cells measured 5 feet by 9 feet. Barely enough room to stretch your arms. Inside each, a steel cot with a thin mattress. A small metal sink. A toilet with no privacy. A single light. A small shelf. Nothing else. The walls dripped with condensation during winter. The floors were cold. The metal doors echoed when slammed shut, vibrating through an inmate's skull. At night, the entire cell block rang with coughing, shifting metal springs, clanking chains, distant footsteps. No one slept well on the Rock. The work, the only escape from madness. Every able-bodied prisoner was forced to work. Laundry duty, tailoring, electrical shop, metal shop, gardening, kitchen prep, dock work. But even work was tightly controlled. Each shop had armed guards with orders to shoot to kill if an inmate attempted escape. One guard wrote, "We weren't here to rehabilitate. We were here to contain." Still, work was the one place where inmates felt semi-human, moving, exerting effort, feeling time pass. Because in the cell, time didn't move. Time suffocated. The yard, the only taste of freedom. Recreation was the one privilege inmates looked forward to. Once a week, prisoners were escorted to the yard, a concrete, windswept area with high walls and open sky. Here they could stretch, walk, exercise, feel sunlight, see birds. But even in the yard, trust was non-existent. Certain corners of the yard belonged to certain prisoners. Men with grudges stayed far apart. Everyone kept their backs to the wall. Fights erupted over minor slights. Still, yard time was life-saving. One inmate said, "The yard was my vacation. It saved my sanity." The hole, Alcatraz's most feared punishment. D-block, known as the hole, was where the worst punishments unfolded. There were two types of solitary confinement. 1. Standard solitary. A dark, cold cell with minimal bedding and restricted meals. 2. The striped cell. The worst of all. No bedding. No toilet, just a hole in the floor. No light. No clothing. No sound. No warmth. A prisoner could be left with only bread and water for days, sometimes weeks. One inmate described being in the hole. "I screamed for hours. The darkness didn't move. Time didn't exist. I thought I had died." Some men left the hole mentally broken. Others never fully recovered. The prison that watched you back. Alcatraz's guards were trained differently from other federal institutions. They were elite marksmen, military veterans, specially screened, equipped with modern weaponry. Their orders were clear. If an inmate attempted escape, the guards were authorized to shoot without warning. Watchtowers overlooked every inch of the island. Gun galleries lined the cell house. Guards above watched the prisoners below with rifles ready. Alcatraz was a place where you always felt watched. Even when you slept. Even when you breathed. Some inmates described it like this: "I knew someone could kill me at any second, legally." The rock's design, escape-proof by architecture and nature. Everything about the island itself worked against escape. Freezing water. Violent tidal pull. Sharks in the bay. Unpredictable waves. Strong currents sweeping toward the Golden Gate. Fog so thick it swallowed sound. Even Olympic-level swimmers struggled to survive more than 20 minutes in those conditions. Guards knew this. Inmates knew this. Journalists knew this. It's what made Alcatraz so terrifying. Because the system wasn't just designed to keep inmates in. It was designed to break their hope of getting out. The rock didn't just break men. It prepared them. Asterisk. Alcatraz was a pressure cooker. A place where minds snapped, spirits crumbled, and legends were stripped down to bone. But here's the twist. In trying to make Alcatraz inescapable, the government inadvertently created the perfect training ground for a few brilliant men. The men who studied the prison, its weaknesses, its rhythms, its guards, and the very nature of the island itself. Men who learned how to exploit the cracks. Men who dared to believe escape was possible. Men who would soon carve their names into history. The stage is set. The tension is building. The impossible is about to begin. The architects of the impossible, Morris and the Anglin brothers, 500-plus characters. By the early 1960s, Alcatraz was beginning to show its age. The salt air corroded steel. The concrete walls flaked. The plumbing groaned like a dying animal. But the prison was still considered escape-proof, not because of its walls but because of its environment. Cold water, vicious currents, razor-sharp tides. Nature itself acted as a second set of guards. For nearly 30 years, the rock earned its reputation. No one escapes Alcatraz. No one. But in 1960, something changed. A man arrived who saw things differently. He didn't see a fortress. He saw a puzzle. A puzzle waiting to be solved. His name was Frank Lee Morris. Frank Morris, the ghost with a genius mind. Morris was unlike any inmate Alcatraz had ever seen. He wasn't the strongest or the most violent. He wasn't a leader of a criminal empire. He wasn't even famous. But he was dangerous in another way. He was intelligent. Formally tested, his IQ placed him in the top 2% of the entire population. He had photographic memory, spoke with precision, observed everything. And he had spent a lifetime breaking out of prisons. Louisiana State Penitentiary? Escape. Atlanta Penitentiary? Escape. Multiple county jails? Escape. Every time someone locked him up, he found a crack, a weakness, a flaw. When he arrived at Alcatraz, Frank Morris studied the prison with calm, silent focus, like an engineer examining a machine. He watched guard movements. He listened to pipes rattle. He observed which lights flickered and which doors jammed. He memorized patrol schedules. Where others saw a hopeless cage, Morris saw patterns. And patterns could be broken. The Anglin brothers, craftsmen of crime. Then came Clarence Anglin and John Anglin, brothers from a poor Georgia family who grew up picking crops and swimming in icy lakes. That last detail mattered. The Anglin brothers knew cold water, really knew it. Water that froze their skin. Water that tightened their lungs. Water that felt like death to most people. When they were caught robbing banks and homes, the Anglins didn't seem extraordinary. Quiet, polite, skilled with their hands. But in prison those hands became dangerous. They could carve. They could sculpt. They could craft tools from almost anything. And they were loyal to each other in a way that gave them power. When the Anglin brothers arrived at Alcatraz in 1961, they were placed just a few cells away from Frank Morris. 3 brilliant craftsmen. 3 escape artists. 3 men with nothing left to lose. The perfect team. Alcatraz's biggest mistake: the ventilation system. The prison administrators believed the cell walls were solid concrete. They weren't. Years of salt air, dripping pipes, and internal moisture had eaten away at the walls. Behind each cell's ventilation grate was crumbling concrete, soft enough to scrape away with metal spoons. And spoons? Well, those were available in the mess hall. Morris noticed the weakness quickly. So did the Anglin brothers. All they needed was a plan that combined secrecy, beat, engineering, improvisation, and absolute trust. And they built one. The plan begins: a spoon, a drill, and a lot of patience. Night after night, Morris and the Anglins chipped away at the ventilation openings behind their sinks. They used cafeteria spoons, a metal file from a workshop, sandpaper made from stolen floor wax and paint, a homemade drill powered by a vacuum cleaner motor. Yes, they literally built a working drill inside Alcatraz. The noise was covered by the daily prison orchestra rehearsals, a stroke of genius. Slowly, carefully they dug through the rotting concrete. Behind the walls was a narrow utility corridor, a maintenance shaft that guards rarely checked. Once inside that shaft, they realized they'd found a highway that ran behind every cell in their block. It was perfect. The dummies, so real the guards never noticed. To fool guards during night counts, the prisoners created life-size dummy heads. These weren't crude toys. They were masterpieces, made from soap, toilet paper, flesh-colored paint, and real human hair stolen from the barbershop. The dummy heads were so realistic that guards performing night checks didn't notice the escapees missing. One dummy even had a small crack on its forehead, matching the real inmate's childhood scar. This was not an impulsive escape. It was surgical precision. The Raft, engineered from raincoats. By 1962, federal prisons issued thousands of rubber raincoats to inmates. Morris saw more than rain protection. He saw material that could be glued, sealed, inflated, and turned into a raft. The inmates stole more than 50 raincoats. They constructed a life raft, pontoon, life vest, and makeshift paddles. They used steam pipes to melt and seal the rubber. Engineering brilliance, built in secret under the noses of armed guards. The goal: the blackness of San Francisco Bay. The escape would depend on a terrifying gamble. The bay: cold, black, violent, unpredictable. But Morris believed they could beat the water. The Anglin brothers had trained for it since childhood. And if the raft failed, they would swim, not toward San Francisco but toward Angel Island, a much closer target. Survival was uncertain. But staying in Alcatraz? That meant death of a different kind. 3 men disappear. On the night of June 11, 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers crawled through their ventilation shafts, climbed into the utility corridor, ascended to the roof, escaped past guards, and disappeared into the freezing bay. No bodies were ever found. No clothing. No tools. No raft fragments. The FBI claimed they drowned. But new evidence says otherwise.